You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by...
Tracy McMillan with Nelson Igard.
Hey, Tracy, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing good. We haven't chatted, actually, since Election Day.
Oh, my. Wow. That was a long time ago. And we are almost at Inauguration Day,
I know.
which is amazing.
Quite a crazy 2.5 months.
No, let's not review it. I'll have nightmares.
We won't. We'll do a little bit, but only related to our fields of expertise. How's that?
Okay. That's great.
What have you been doing? What have you been up to in these, as Stephen Colbert says, quarantine while?
Well, we went through the holiday period, which was quiet, but also good. I mean, now that we're here in Arizona and the weather is, dry and mild because we're not in the mountains. So it was fine. And we didn't, see any family. So it was kind of, like I said, it was quiet. I cooked good food and we just hung out. And work was crazy busy in December. So, the holidays were kind of like a rest and recovery period, rejuvenation. And then, went back to work on, January 4th? Like, all right, feel good. And then, the
Other
world
stuff.
just
Other stuff.
fell off a cliff. So
Yeah.
I think, like you said, since we spoke on election night, it's probably like many of us, it's just been a roller coaster of emotions and things going on and trying not to have this train wreck fixation on the news cycle. But the news is history. So
Right. I try to, I try to be optimistic, but it's hard when all these things are kind of stacked on top of you. It's almost like you're laying on the floor and somebody keeps on putting bricks on your chest, and like one after the other. And after a while, they get kind of heavy. And mentally, I think because we can't go, see our friends and do the things that we, have routines that are outside of the normal. Not like my work routine's pretty normal as it was before, but I used to go to happy hour the first of the month and used to do, all these things, but just, go out and explore the city a bit more. I mean, we do, but it's not quite, the walks aren't quite the same. And you can't just stop into places and check out a gallery or, those types of things. So it's a little bit different. As we've been talking about all year. I mean, we've been kind of documenting our process for all this as we've talked, but yeah, it's just, I'm looking forward to, this introvert is looking forward to being a little bit more extroverted.
yeah, we've been trying to do socially distanced activities, lots of walks and hikes, bike rides. I will say I do like to play golf. So I will go and play golf, and you're far apart from everybody. It's an outside activity. So that has happened every once in a while. And then I just, again, like that quiet period over the holidays, I've kind of finally rediscovered my pottery again. And I'm not, I'm still a beginner. I'm not all that good, but it's just a really nice, it's all I think about. Like when I'm sitting there working with the clay, that's all I'm thinking about. Everything else is like shut out of the mind. It is a fascinating thing. I don't know that I've hardly ever had an experience like that because even running never shut anything out of the mind. It helped to provide clarity in a lot of ways and help think through things. It didn't block things out.
Right.
So it's a really interesting process.
Yeah. Running is so, it's such a thing where you don't have to think to run. You just do it. And so your mind is open for all kinds of stuff. We used to, when we were running just training and we had those 10-mile easy days or whatever, we just spout off all of the movie lines we could remember, basically. It was like this kind of crazy club where all you did was talk about, Celebrity Jeopardy with Will Ferrell or whatever, and just try to remember all the lines from the week before. But yeah, and then, but if you have like a task, and I found this too, actually, when I was in high school, I used to go in my room and do my homework, and I would put music on, but it actually made me focus more because I'd I'd actually actively have to focus and block it out for some reason. So maybe the pottery is just a way to you're focusing on this one thing. And so there's no way to focus on other things because you have to be focused on that thing. Yeah. Yeah. So, that's probably a good idea. Maybe puzzles are kind of similar, or doing, tasks that I find sometimes that doing dishes, sometimes I would listen to podcasts, but doing dishes and things. I think I mentioned this before too, is like one thing I like about dishes though, is that, and I know a lot of people don't like doing dishes, but you actually finish it. And as a planner, finishing the dishes, and as a planner whose work kind of goes endlessly for years and years and years, finishing the dishes and getting something accomplished actually feels pretty good.
Can you tell my son that?
Well, if he has a good podcast he wants to listen to, he could just, do that and do the dishes. I listen to my Star Wars podcasts or my Star Wars audiobooks. There's a bunch of new ones coming out that I need to get in. So, maybe some of his interests can follow him to the dishwashing arena.
That's right. Like we were talking about earlier, we need to get him on the anime podcasts or anime audio books rather than physically watching the anime.
Yeah, that would be good. Well, so this is episode 79, Shut In Anonymous 101 is in session. Some smaller news things of note. Pete Buttigieg, who we had actually talked about for the last Mondays before, we had a real quick one before Christmas because the nomination, and to talk about Pete a little bit. He's going to be having his confirmation hearings on Thursday this week. And then today, Polly Trottenberg, former New York City DOT commissioner, was nominated for Assistant Secretary of Transportation. So I think a lot of people will see that as a positive step for cities. I know that some folks in New York, kind of push back on Polly a little bit because they felt like she wasn't going fast enough to build bus and bike lanes. But I think anytime you can have somebody who knows what NACTO is and knows how cities can actually operate when they're valuable, they're treated as valuable, I think is a good thing. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that today, or if you had heard that.
I had heard that. It was shared on our Slack channels and I saw it on Twitter, and I think it's great. One, to have a woman in that role is fantastic. We've talked often on the podcast about diversity of lived experiences, and the diversity of the Biden administration cabinet as a whole is fantastic, from top to bottom in terms of who he's named. And I think that her experience in a large major city and understanding everything that's involved in municipal transportation is really an important perspective to bring that multimodal knowledge and hopefully, paradigm shift that is really needed within many aspects, many departments under the Department of Transportation.
Yeah.
Like you've mentioned before multiple times, the 80-20. We love to see some change at NHTSA, and I mean, there's just any endless number of things on the list.
Acronyms.
That would be yes, that would be great.
We need a new one, a NOAA, any number of acronyms.
Yeah, but I like that.
I like that too. Actually, this came to my head. Well, we'll talk about that in a second in the Washington Monthly article, because I think that focuses on some of those city issues that the new administration is going to be, coming up against. But before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both Mondays at the Overhead Wire and Talking Headways on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. Thanks to everyone who subscribes through podcatchers. We appreciate that you keep coming back, and we want you to keep coming back for more. So we'll have new episodes this month and next month coming up that are going to be awesome because there's going to be a lot of news, I think. I think there's going to be a lot of news. But let's get to the main discussion, shall we? So the first article I had on our list, so I do want to say, we're starting a new year, and so this is the first Monday show of 2021. The articles aren't just chosen randomly. I mean, they kind of are, but not really. They are actually picked from the most read articles from the newsletter, the Overhead Wire Daily. So some of I pick kind of the top 10 each week, and then I kind of go through them and see what might be interesting to talk about and pick out of that group. So these are actually ones that people who were reading the newsletter thought were really interesting and wanted to click through on. So we're going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. But the first one is from Washington Monthly and written by Daniel Block, and basically it talks about using federal power to liberate localities. So Democrats and Republicans use the federal government to regulate what cities and towns around the United States can do, albeit in different ways. But in the progressive tradition of the New Deal era, the incoming administration should empower local governments to implement policies such as local broadband and transportation policy without having to rely on hostile states. Tracy, what did you think about the piece that was written in Washington Monthly?
It was really interesting. One, the history of the portrayal of Republicans and Democrats over time, and really that it's been both parties that have pushed back against whether to give states, take away states' ability to regulate or not regulate, and then looking down, as you said, to this local level. It was a long piece, so I didn't get through it as much as I will in later days this week. But I mean, it's a really interesting piece to consider coming from, say, a state like California that has been, in my perspective, maybe more progressive in terms of the distribution of funds and setting up programs to distribute it, but knowing that there is still a ton of tension in that process. And then to think about other states where there is not as much at the state level, there is a stronghold on the funds to a much greater extent, and maybe political maneuvering that's happening. So I think creating some type of system that allows for one, even in thinking about the article that we're going to mention on Paris and participatory budgeting, allowing that participatory process to happen across the state, I think a welcome change. And I like, obviously, featuring the transportation alternatives program speaks to me because of the diversity of needs that program can meet. Multimodal transportation, particularly bike and pedestrian access and promotion and safety. And its predecessor also was the victim of political maneuverings and the diversification of funds towards historical railroad and beautification, and not solely for bike and ped.
That's an interesting point about California versus other states, because like you said, California has been so, I'll use this term, but I don't necessarily, I mean, it's a weird term these days, progressive.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially in,
I hesitate to use it too.
Very progressive in the sense that they have been legislating from the state level kind of almost over localities who have been pushing back, which is opposite of many other places where localities want to do more. And you think of places like Indiana, where Indianapolis really, really wanted a sales tax to do bus, service, just bus service even, and they wanted to build BRT. And the state legislature, they had to go and really lobby to get the ability to even ask their people, even put a ballot measure on the ballot. The state of Texas does some similar things where they want to make, they've always hated the city of Austin. The state has. So they've always, legislated for creating MTAs in Texas. Austin was left out because they weren't a city that was over 200,000 population at the time or whatever when they first, in 1976 when they first started thinking about transit agencies in the state. So there's an interesting kind of bottom up, top down, but almost from side to side, from one part of the country to the other. And the thing that's interesting also is the way that this article discussed the ways in which Democrats and Republicans kind of think about this top-down authority that the federal government has to allow or not or restrict cities and states to do things. So I like the idea that they said in here about talking about how usually Democrats, when they legislate from the federal level, they put a floor on things. So it's like a minimum wage where you're like, you can you can have $15 an hour, but if you want to go higher, you can, but it's up to you. You have to have a floor. Whereas at the, for the Republicans, it's usually a ceiling where it's like, you can't go past this on things like broadband, where, basically they're like, well, you can't have a public broadband. You can't do this. The telecoms are going to do this. And so that's their jurisdiction. So you can't do that. So it was really interesting because both use it kind of the same way to tell cities and states what to do, but it's in a different kind of format. So the idea in this article was saying that Joe Biden basically should empower cities to do things that nominally or usually that the state might not allow them to do. And the same thing goes for federal transportation funding as well, where he's saying, the author is saying that the feds should actually open up applications for for federal monies, not just to the states, which have typically gotten 80% of the funding, and then have passed it down, which a lot of times they don't do. And then allow cities and other jurisdictions, maybe transit agencies, to actually apply for certain things. And this was actually done in the Obama administration with the TIFIA loans and the RRIF, which is a railroad infrastructure funding mechanism. And so, expanding on those to actually allow cities to go after funds for bike and ped without having to go through like a state sponsor or those types of things might be good for some of these, some of these blue cities and red states, but also smaller cities that feel like they aren't getting enough of the attention that they need from the federal government.
The author didn't talk at all about MPOs in this relationship. Where do you see them fitting
Well, so a
in?
lot of times, in California, we have MPOs that actually get an automatic pass through because of state law through. So we actually don't have the same problem, I think, that a lot of other states do, where the money goes to the state DOT and then it gets stuck there. Whereas in California, a lot of money is actually supposed to be passed through the MPO, which actually alleviates some of that problem. But in a lot of states, the MPOs are like, they get the funding and then they don't allocate it, or they allocate it to something else. So you might get some sidewalk money, but it might go to somewhere where they don't need it. And so, yeah, that was another part of the piece that was interesting too, is like how much, state DOTs are run by, road builders and folks that aren't thinking about cities' best interests necessarily. And so, bypassing that is a really important thing. The MPOs, I think, that needs to be overhauled as well to a certain extent, because a lot of times MPOs, and we've talked about this on the show before, they have these boards that are set up to be very suburban oriented. And so the cities don't get as much say in what happens in the MPO. And so in that same scenario, it goes more to roads than it does to serving people inside the city on a proportional basis, right? So you have all these suburban roads that, will go into the periphery, but then you'll have a lack of funding for transit or for sidewalks or for bike lanes or for those things that urban constituents might be interested in.
Yeah, it was an interesting piece. Like I said, I look forward to reading through it all, because it is also a great article, as you've talked about before, that infrastructure, when we're talking about infrastructure, it's more, we obviously focus a lot on transportation infrastructure, and particularly surface transportation infrastructure. And infrastructure is so much more within, the conversation is broader than that, and that article really highlights it in terms of energy, environment, broadband, other utilities that are in the same situation, and opportunity for change that transportation is.
And I will point out that the article also, they mentioned broadband, which is another one that's kind of close to my heart to a certain extent because of the infrastructure kind of connection to transportation. But it says in the article, at least 22 states, a full half of which are under unified GOP control, have passed laws pushed by wealthy telecom companies that ban or severely limit municipal broadband. And so in some of those places where they've actually done municipal broadband, like in, I think it was Chattanooga is one of the cities, they've actually been able to do some really cool stuff. And the limits of what some states have on broadband connectivity, and we spend billions of dollars a year. They mentioned this in the article too. They spend billions of dollars a year where we just give it to the telecom companies and say, hey, you guys create this kind of last mile to some of these folks that need it, but they don't really do the best job at it. A municipal system could actually do better, and maybe it even provide more competition. We've talked with folks about broadband on the show before on Talking Headways, and there might be a benefit to actually just cities building all the pipes like they do the roads, and then letting private companies or whoever else maybe compete for the ability to operate services on those pipes. There is something to be said for allowing some competition, but putting together the basic infrastructure for what is needed overall, and then letting other folks compete with each other to try to drive some of the prices down. So I think that there's a lot of things that we can do to connect people with schools, with healthcare, with all the stuff that we talk about that's really important, that transportation does as well.
It just drives me crazy that the root of all this is power and control. And it's hard. It is hard. And, hopefully we'll be able to, I don't know what'll happen over the next few years, but an understanding that you can open up the door to opportunity to others. And it, as Brene Brown would say, opening yourself up to that vulnerability and, what you may perceive as a threat to your power is actually empowering to others and to yourself, and to give it a try. Stop being so.
It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. I think a lot of people think that there's only a finite amount of resources, musical chairs, as it were, and it's not like that.
Right.
All right, stop lines don't stop traffic. A 14-year study in Minnesota of those white lines that accompany stop signs found that they don't seem to make a difference in whether people stop or not. Collisions were basically unchanged before and after the white lines were installed, though they did find that people slowed down when approaching the line. So I thought this was just kind of a fun little interesting study that I had never thought about before. I never thought about whether people stopped at the stop lines. I just thought if they stopped at the stop signs.
Yeah, it's I saw it come through on Twitter yesterday, the day, just the past few days, and I also thought it was funny. I meant to look up. We did, for one of our projects this past year, we did a pedestrian bicycle safety education campaign for Stanislaus County in California. In the survey and on the project website, we had a road rules quiz. The survey had more questions to test your knowledge on road rules, and I feel like the stop line was one of the questions that we had asked regarding, what's it there for? So I'll have to go back and look up what the responses were if we ended up keeping that question, because I created several questions for the quiz. Certainly it's not surprising, and I think to me, when I read the article, it also brought up the fact that we don't re-educate drivers very often. The majority of people receive, if they are a driver, they receive their driver's license when they're a teenager, mid to late teens, and maybe they are retested in a short test at some point over their 60, 70-year driving period. And stop lines may be a question on that driver education exam and road test, but maybe it's not. And to the majority of people, I would venture to guess that there are a lot of people out there that don't even realize that they have to stop at the stop line. And also the article talked about the standard behavior of the California roll, or the rolling through the intersection, or at least going to where you can see you see the line of sight. The stop line assumes that people have an understanding of what it is meant for, and there's no re-education or reinforcement of that, let alone stop signs. which are an enforceable traffic
Do you
control
remember?
measure.
Do you ever remember, like, maybe hearing this from a friend or something, where people would joke around and say, "Well, if a stop sign doesn't have a white border, then it's not a real stop sign." Like, if it's inside a mall parking lot or whatever, some people would just try to joke with other people and say, it's not. If it's just there and it's not got a white line around it, then you can't. You don't have to follow the rule. Like, I mean, no,
I didn't
but
know
that's it's not even true.
I know.
But
I
people
know.
would try to, like, goof on other people and say that those stupid things. That has probably led to more than a few collisions in mall parking lots.
Fender benders and mall program. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I just never thought of the line. I just thought it was there because it was an accompaniment to the stop sign where you just had to stop behind the line. But it's so interesting to all these things. I mean, there's so many little, the MUCTD, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. Yeah.
TCD.
Did I do the wrong acronym? I don't.
You did MUCTD. Yeah.
The Manual on
Booked it.
Controlling Traffic Device, whatever. You all know what I'm talking about. There's so many little devices and things in there that control things, and as we talked before, there's just a couple of old men that control what goes into this too. So these types of studies kind of show how sometimes ridiculous some of the things that we do are without, a scientific basis behind it.
Yeah, Peter Kuntz may be mad that you said only old men control would go into that, because I think he's involved in
Maybe he might be the only
draft
one.
Revision and Bill O'Toole and yeah. I seem to remember. I feel like, I will admit, like, I'm kind of generally a rule follower.
Me too.
I feel like when I was growing up and doing my driving, that I was taught that you stopped at the white line. If the white line preceded the stop sign, you stopped at the white line, because there was the stop sign was placed related to traffic control regulations, and then the stop line was related to where the line of sight was. So you should, and if they were in the same spot, then that's where the line of sight was. But if the white line was preceded the stop sign, then that indicates where you should stop and then move forward cautiously.
Well, yeah, here in San Francisco, Muni, actually, some of the turning radii on the LRVs, when they're turning, you have to, if you stop at the stop sign, you're going to get hit by one. So there's a white line that's back a little further at an angle that keeps you from getting hit by the light rail vehicle. So I realize there's a reason for them necessarily, and you make really good points. It's just funny that people don't follow that rule because they don't understand why. And I too am a rule follower.
Again, there are many rules that people do not follow on the road
or anywhere.
Yes, exactly. Regardless of their own safety. It's also interesting that this was a 14-year study.
Mm-hmm. That's a long time, huh? To be looking at stop lines.
It's a very long time to study it. Wait, stop lines. But thank you for the study.
Thank you,
everyone.
Minnesota.
I did appreciate that they brought up the point about it's a fairly minor thing in terms of the cost of installing a stop line, but there is a real cost to maintenance of infrastructure, including paint and the applications that are utilized on road surfaces. And for locations like the Midwestern state, or the states that have more wear and tear on their roadways because of weather and whatnot, that does add up. It could be an expenditure that could go somewhere else for sure. And so it's minor, but yet it's not.
Yeah, they add up after a while. I think it said something like $1,000 or something for the seasonal, fixing of some of these white lines. Not individually, but that would be a lot. To paint a white line would be $1,000, but over time, those types of expenditures add up.
Yeah, if it's $1,000 a line, I'm in the wrong business.
I'm going to start a white line business.
That's right.
Dear. All right, Paris's participatory budget. Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, will open up participatory budgeting to let Parisians decide projects they want to focus on. 25% of the city's budget will be allocated in this way and is seen as crucial for building renewed trust in government. I knew about participatory planning and those types of things, but I hadn't really paid much attention to budgeting. Have you heard of this before?
I haven't. I thought it was a really fascinating article and certainly kept Paris at the top of the list of international destinations to visit once we're able to travel. And so I thought it was a very interesting article. I was inspired by it and also appreciated at the end in a sense the note of caution in terms of like our public processes, the need to be sure that it is inclusively participatory and that everyone has a voice, and there is, as much as we can encourage participation across a diverse population, get everyone engaged, and also to ensure that there isn't bias in the processes.
Yeah. So, this one was in City Monitor, which, by the way, has been having a lot of great pieces lately. They are pretty new. I mean, it used to be called City Metric, but now it's called City Monitor. And Allison Arieff, who used to be at Spur and is a editorial writer at the New York Times, is one of the editors there. And I think Summer Mathis as well, who used to be at City Lab. So they're doing some really interesting stuff. And I think they're trying to do more really kind of hard-hitting reporting. And this is really good stuff. And they do international stuff. Obviously, City Monitor is based in London. So they're doing a lot more kind of international stuff, which some people like and some people don't. I do know that from the newsletter, for some reason, people don't click on international articles as much, even if they're super interesting. So that's really interesting. Maybe it's just because they're focused on their jobs and not thinking about what other cities are doing. But yeah, so Anoush Touranian, who is the deputy mayor of Paris, it's a tongue twister. He says that the participatory budget is more important than ever before. We are facing a democratic crisis and a great questioning of society. We believe that citizen power and a collective response is the answer. And so they also say that it'll include consultations over flagship projects and neighborhood redevelopment with the pandemic and other developments in society. Leading to tumbling confidence in governments. This move is seen by City Hall as a crucial tool for building trust among residents who will play a more active role in the ideas and decisions that shape their collective future. So the first iteration, there were 15 proposals and 40,000 people with a budget of 20 million euro. And it's going to go to 100 million euro and 5% of Paris's budget this year. And then in the future, it'll be 25%. So it's kind of a gradual build up to participatory to kind of get, I think, in part to kind of, get the program to work the way that they think it should work, and then move it to have more people get more empowered over time. And I think that's a very valuable thing. And I like the idea of allowing people to make suggestions and people to vote on it and to spend money that way. Because we have all these arguments about how to spend money all the time and whether, folks should do this or do that. And we have big arguments at City Hall about how money should be spent. But allowing the participatory process, if it's a good process to work, I think can actually turn the table on what they're worried about, which is a kind of a reduced faith in government.
I liked it for all those reasons, and it also recognizes that the citizenry also has an understanding and brings an inherent knowledge, a lived experience, a knowledge of their neighborhood and what the needs are. That this, in cities across the globe, the powers that be don't necessarily, well, they don't have the time or money or ability or maybe even desire to know what is the need at the neighborhood level, at each level, or for within each community or population group. And so this is this grassroots process to say, hey, we're sitting in this neighborhood and this is what we feel like we need here. And it also recognizes the expertise that exists across the city. that I loved the story of the gentleman who had moved from Italy and felt like there was a need, was he had learned and experienced in Italy, for urban forestry, and submitted a proposal for that idea. It wasn't, I didn't get the sense that he did it suggesting it for his particular neighborhood, just that it was an idea that was important for the city. So he had knowledge to share, and he wanted to share it with the city to benefit the city. And that's a wonderful process. And I think it was an article, kind of almost a feel-good piece that we need right now to know that there's positive participatory action happening.
And it's not just the adults either. Anyone age 7 and above can take part.
I love that too.
There are no limits on the visa status or nationality of participants. Anybody can take part. That age 7 piece really got me, because there was actually another piece that I didn't talk about. We're not going to talk about this week, but it's in my newsletter. There was a piece in The Conversation, which is another great kind of organization to where you can source news and information from academics who write regular kind of news pieces. But basically, are saying that children in New Zealand, they surprised researchers when they knew more about their cities and cared more about their cities than the researchers thought they would. And children live in cities too, and they know what they want or what they need or what they think other people need. And one of the things that kind of stood out to me, and I think to the researchers, was how empathetic they were to what other people needed. They weren't super selfish. So I think that's really good to get younger folks involved, because sometimes they see things with fresh eyes that some of us jaded older folks might just poo-poo or look past.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved the opportunity I had to work with the Bernard Van Leer Foundation on their Urban 95 project, which was, the idea of thinking about and planning cities from the perspective of caregivers and children that are around 3 or 95 centimeters and below. So it's around 3 years old. And the cities that the foundation was working with to implement that program, they had to involve children. Children were involved in that process. So the children in participatory planning should be a no-brainer. And it's also, there's a lot that's been written over the past few years on the child-friendly city, and it's a very positive movement.
Yeah. I wish I would have known about cities and planning. I mean, I knew about them. We did little things here and there that kind of got me interested in maps and things like that. But I wish there was more intentional kind of discussion about cities and how they are built in 2nd, 3rd grade, 4th grade, those types of places.
Mm-hmm. So how old, I think we've talked about this before, how old were you when your interest began?
Well, I think I was in 3rd grade. I can remember the room. It was a portable room in Bakersfield. And we sat down and they had us do a mapping exercise. And they gave us those placemat maps where there's a placemat and it's kind of laminated, and then there's a church in one spot, and there's a police station, a fire station, your house, all that stuff in there. It's a direction challenge where you're given a little crayon and you're supposed to draw, and they can erase it later, but you're supposed to draw, how do you get to, on these roads, how do you get to the post office, or how do you get to the church or whatever? How do you get to the school? And I just remember that was fascinating. I was in. I loved it.
That is wild.
And that's kind of what initially got me thinking about maps and cities. It didn't translate necessarily to city planning at the time, but later on when I was at Texas and I was doing kinesiology stuff, I thought I wanted to be a track coach, and I decided that probably wasn't what I like. Teaching kids running and things like that, but it wasn't probably for me. And so you have to pick a major after your sophomore year, I think, to go get a degree. And so I saw geography. I thought history first, and then I was like, well, my dad and my sister took history, and they didn't quite go that direction. So maybe I should do something else. So I did geography because I thought, I love maps. I love all that stuff that's related to that. And I started taking classes in the geography department at University of Texas and got some really great teachers. Shane Davies was probably one of my favorites, Professor Davies, and he taught a class on cities and talked about the death of distance. And he had these classes that was almost like architecture class that he'd just do slide decks and talk about cities for the whole class. And so that was where I got really interested. And then, a friend of mine told me about planning school. And after I graduated from undergrad in geography, I just went straight to planning school. And so I feel like, that's kind of all started from that love of that map in second or third grade.
That's great.
Yeah, it was fun. I miss those days when all you had to do is color on a map. Oh, well, I should ask you then, how did you get into planning and transportation?
Oh, I also did love maps. And knowing where we were going. I certainly never slept in the car and always wanted to be observing the area around us. But I didn't make that leap until, career-wise and education-wise, until I was in my 20s, after I had done an exercise science degree, and then doing the public health degree. That's where I started making the connection, because I was looking at preventive health and aspects of physical activity. And then I had the internship at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in nutrition and physical activity. And that's when they were starting to talk about environment and policy. That was mid 90s, early 90s. Sorry, I'm old.
No.
It was
my grandma's old.
Your grandma's amazing. Yeah, so that was a real paradigm shift for sure. And it just changed the way that I looked at the impact of the built environment on how we live. So public health started that for me. And, starting with physical activity and nutrition. And obviously we looked at access to all different things. Tobacco control was very instrumental in introducing policy and environment aspects into other areas of public health. So it was a sea change then. It just shaped my way, who I was from that point forward.
Yeah, there's so many interesting things about the 90s and the 80s and what was going on then, and the shifts that were happening, and the coming of the new programs and the changes from Ice-T onward with the money that was going forward. So I think that's part of why the federal policy is so important, is because there's the ability to make people like you, where it creates people who are thinking differently about things and interested in the future of how things get done. So super important.
Yeah. And realizing, and this is what we hope will happen with a new administration, realizing that all the components have to be in place. Certainly, the institutional infrastructure has to be in place, and trust and strength and intellectual capacity in the science, and protection of the political maneuvering around it. There has to be policy in place, and then there has to be funding to support the change. And that was the sea change that happened with Ice-T in terms of pedestrian and bicycle, to be able to see some of that shift begin to occur. It's like when California passed the Safe Routes legislation in 1999. There wasn't a program like that to take then that federal money to allocate it towards that particular type of programming for children.
And for those who might not be familiar, in 1992, when Ice-T was the federal transportation bill that passed, the Intermodal Surface Transportation
Surface Transportation
Efficiency Act.
Efficiency Act.
All these acronyms.
Ooh, ANOA.
ANOA. That's right. Another ANOA. All right. Well, let's shift gears to climate a little bit, shall we?
Mhm.
Winter festivals and climate. Many of the winter traditions that exist in the northern United States could come to an end as climate change reduces the number of days with snow and ice on lakes. In the Great Lakes region, that time could be shortened by a month. This could put an economic damper on the fun and draw close to traditions such as snowmobile racing that residents of these areas have known for decades. Ice fishing as well is one of those things, and all the winter type sports. This is by Keith Matheny in the Detroit Free Press, and it kind of echoes an article that I read in actually recently. I'm kind of behind in my National Geographics, but I read recently in the September edition of National Geographic that talks about this same exact thing. There's 2 million ice anglers in the United States who look forward to the chill of winter every year from that article specifically. So this piece, I wanted to include it in the articles, and I wanted to include it here because I think for me, when I read it, it really kind of drove home the impacts of climate change on actual activities. The idea that people really do depend on the ice in the winter months in places like Michigan and Wisconsin and in Minnesota for their recreation, for Minnesota for their for their annual income, for a different way of life. And that could change because of climate change over time. Basically, what happens is this cycle where the ice, if it doesn't, and if the water doesn't heats up too much in the summer, then it can't cool down enough in the winter, and then it can't cool down enough to where it heats up even more the next summer, and so we perpetuate this cycle whereby by 2080 they project that snowfall could decline by 48% in the Great Lakes Basin. And then there will be 15 to 16 fewer days with minimum temperature below freezing in the Great Lakes Basin by 2030. So those are the types of things that kind of like keep me up at night sometimes worrying about. And there's a whole economic imperative around it as well.
What I wanted, and the end of the article touched on it a little bit, the degree to which there was cognitive dissonance or not about the activities that were going on and just the general lifestyle that people may have outside of doing this activity, their everyday activities, and how that's impacting climate. And since the climate was impacted, it impacted the activities they love to do for recreation.
Right.
So can I make, and that was maybe it needed to be a much longer article to close that loop, but.
Well, I'll link to the National Geographic one because I think that one, I don't know if it closed that loop specifically of the cognitive dissonance a little bit, but it did actually have a lot more detail in terms of the scientific basis for the climate change, but also talking about some of those winter sports. Winter and skiing and snowmobiling account for $3.5 billion. An ice fishing tournament can inject hundreds of thousands of dollars into a local community, which doesn't happen if the ice isn't there. So those types of numbers, the numbers talking about how there's going to be a decline in the days below freezing. It could be up to a month of days where it's not cold. When basically you're thinking of a season going from a November, maybe a December to a February, March. Maybe it's only a December and January type of thing in the future. That's really sad and dispiriting, especially when you do have all this stuff happening that you can control. You don't have to be spewing so many greenhouse gas emissions. And everybody has their pet issue, whether it's red meat or driving cars or whatever. But there's just needs to be an overall focus on reducing climate change overall, because at some point we're not going to have this thing called a white Christmas. I mean, I always think it's funny when the Christmas around the world is kind of focused on these kind of Western ideals of Santa Claus and or Sinterklaas or whoever it is in a white snowy ideal, whereas in Australia it's hanging out on the beach because it's 60 degrees. I mean, 60 degrees Celsius sometimes. Be on with your family because but still celebrating Christmas the same way. And I just think that's interesting. But it also kind of it gives you a preview maybe of what Christmas might be in the Northern Hemisphere at a certain time because of climate change, that type of year. And Christmas to me isn't necessarily a religious celebration, but a family celebration. So, I think that realization, I think, kind of can hit people kind of hard when they realize maybe this winter time, which is kind of a time full of wonder, might not be so wonderful in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot of weight to the whole issue. And again, happy or hopeful that we'll, at least in the US, will have a new administration in place that recognizes the gravity of the situation.
Yeah. So I recommend, I'll have all the articles, as I always do, in the show notes at theoverheadwire.com, but also in the podcatcher, wherever you get your podcasts. Just go down, scroll down into the notes, and you'll see all the links because we put them there. So I'll post both the National Geographic article and the Detroit Free Press article, which are both really interesting, and will open your eyes, I think, a little bit if you hadn't had them. I mean, most of our listeners are, they're the smartest, so we don't have to worry about that. But it opened my eyes for sure, even though I've been talking about this a lot. So I think it's interesting. The last one we have for today: did the pandemic kill the commute? This one is in City Lab. And before the pandemic, about 10% of workers were super commuters with trips of 60 minutes or more each way. Many rank commuting as one of the least enjoyable tasks of their day. But in the pandemic, some are missing the commute as a way to get alone time or separate work from home. Tracy, as somebody who used to commute, and I haven't commuted since about 2013, so I'm not sure. I appreciate my experiences commuting, but I haven't done it for 6 years. So I'm wondering what your experience is now in this pandemic. Are you missing your commute? Are you lamenting that you don't get that time, or are you happy that you get more time at home? What's your kind of feeling about your commute?
I thought a lot about that as I was reading this article. As you probably remember, before moving back to California and take my position or to be working in California in my role with UC Berkeley Safe Trek, I was in Flagstaff, and I too hadn't commuted between 2007 and 2018. I was working at home.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a long time where I was already a work from home person.
Yeah.
And prior to that, I was at Texas and had a short bus commute. But when I went back and first had my 4-mile bike or bus commute between home and the Cal campus, and then when I started working for Nelson Nygaard, and I had a 14-mile commute, which was the longest commute I have ever had in my whole life, from Mill Valley into San Francisco, doing that by bike or by bus. And the bike was bike in and then ferry and bike home. I loved that. It was long. It added to the day, but however I took that journey, whether it was all bus or a bike ferry combination, there was joy that I got out of it in so many ways. It was certainly the bike ferry combination was the most beautiful commute I will ever have. And I got a lot of mental benefit out of it. And like the author in this piece, I did work either direction. Well, not on the bike, but there was aspects, or I listened to the podcasts. I read articles prepping for our podcasts. I was much better at keeping up with what was on the Overhead Wire daily newsletter. So it was productive time for me. And the article also made me think when I was going to school at UC Irvine, there was, we lived in various locations. Some of the time we lived right on campus, but there were other times where we lived down in San Diego County because of my husband's work. And I would take the commuter rail up the Metrolink from Oceanside, California to Irvine, and then bike or bus to campus. And this was my second favorite commute. Coming back home from Irvine and taking the bend at Dana Point. So you're riding inland on the rail line, and then all of a sudden you take the bend, head south at Dana Point in Orange County, and all of a sudden the ocean is in front of you and it's beside you. And it was like a mental release. And so while it was, again, like it was exhausting, there was something beautiful about it, and it was nice alone time. And so now I don't get that. We're here all together,
Mm-hmm.
and that's nice, but there is some like that physical separation, and not only from I love my family, but physical separation from family, but also the separation from work and being able to kind of either immediately turn it off or to end the day by wrapping up like those last things, and then whoosh, as the author talked about, you're home and the door is shut, and there isn't that you have to the lines blur a lot more now. And just like when I was working from home before, and it was a little different, and when I was running my own business, the lines always blurred, but even now they blur.
Yeah, that's how I feel. It's blurry. You're talking about your favorite kind of view. I remember I worked in Oakland. I just commuted by BART, and then once you there's a spot between when you get out of downtown Oakland and you hit the post office, kind of between 12th Street Oakland and West Oakland, where if you're standing, which I often was on the way back to the city, if you're standing and the sunset is coming on and it's kind of falling over the city, and then some days when the air quality is not so good, but it's good for sunsets, you could see kind of all the buildings silhouetted in the sunset, and you could see the bridge and all that stuff for a slight, for like maybe like 15, 20 seconds, but you knew exactly where it was. So you always looked up at that point. And that, I remember that because it was beautiful, and it was like, okay, I'm going home. I'm going back to the city, which is a place that I love. So I like that. And I did like my commute. I liked listening to my podcast. I didn't like early morning meetings that I had to be that I was late for because I woke up a little later. I showered a little long or something like that. But yeah, there's something to be said for a commute, and kind of, it's also a shared experience. I think it's a shared American experience. I think, around the world, there's definitely commutes, but it's a weird shared American experience that everybody has at one point in their life or another. Even if you work at home, you probably worked somewhere at some point else where you had to commute, you had to drive, or you had to take a bus or a train or something like that. So I think they mentioned that article talking about that kind of shared experience and how we have to stick together and those types of things, and the little things like noticing the same person getting on your train every day, or seeing the same thing at the exit, or things like that. It's kind of it's almost relaxing to have that kind of routine. I think routine people like to a certain extent, for the most part.
Yeah, my aunt, my dad's sister, she in New York State, they lived in the Poughkeepsie area along the Hudson River, and she commuted down to Manhattan. She worked for, I think, the Bank of New York, and there was absolutely no reason, like in terms of job location, why she had to commute that far. She probably, I think she could have had a position at a closer branch. But she was one of those little social butterfly commuters that author talked about that had her family
Mhm.
on the train, and they knew each other's families. They knew what was going on in their lives. Birthdays were celebrated. All these events were celebrated. It was this community that I think was. It was also interesting because I think it was her community. It didn't necessarily blend over into her home environment. That was kind of a different part of her life, and yeah, that was one of the things that really defined her in the family's eyes. So I don't know. I mean, it's, as the article talks about, commuting. There's a lot that's not great about commuting, but it's not necessarily all bad. I mean, there's aspects of it that people do like, or there's certainly reasons why they have to do it or choose to do it. And it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how the patterns change over the next few years.
Yeah, I think it will change. I think everything's going to change. I think quote unquote normal won't be normal anymore. I think there's going to be a new normal, whatever that might be. And commuting is going to be something that won't quite be normal for a lot of folks after this. So we'll see what happens. I'm interested in the TRB paper 10 years from now to see the before times and the after times and what the shift was. You always see these kind of inflection points in history when you're reading or you're watching the History Channel or something like that. And I think we're living in one, and it's kind of weird to me to realize that that this is something that's going to change. It's like the Industrial Revolution, like, stuff getting produced, and it changed everything. And we're living in that right now. And we're not sure what the future is, but we know but we know from past experience that it will be different. We just don't know. We just don't know what that is. So I think that's fascinating. I'd love to hear what folks listening, what your favorite commute was. I'd love that. That's a good write-in, topic. Send us your listener questions and comments, theoverheadwire@gmail.com, and send us your favorite commute. And maybe we'll share it in one of our future listener questions and comments sections, because that'd be fun. Because I think people have good commutes, people have bad commutes. They have the shared experiences. I know that there's a Friday train from Sacramento to San Francisco to the Bay Area on Amtrak that seems to be raucous and fun. So everybody has a different experience, and there's a lot of good ones out there.
I will say that there are times I've gone through that bar car.
Maybe Friday.
Gone through or gone to.
Maybe Friday. Yeah, maybe Friday everywhere. Yeah. Well, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without you, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. I've had folks sign up today. $2 a month will get you some stickers, and $10 a month will get you our bus-only scarf, which I have back in stock now. I know it's sold out before Christmas, but we're back, and I have all the bus-only scarves, so feel free to go to theoverheadwire.com and order one or become a Patreon supporter. I also want to mention that we produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning and Practice. So if you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. The book was fun to produce, and if you're a History of Planning fan, it's the very first one listed on the American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books of Planning. So go check that out if you get a chance. It's like listening to a podcast. So Puppies and Butterflies is the part of the show where we find something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in other sections. Tracy, I didn't even think about Puppies and Butterflies. I think I've been watching, I watched Ted Lasso over the break, and that was really good.
It was wonderful.
Yeah,
it was. We watched it a few weeks ago too, and it was just nice.
Yeah, it was kind of it was a nice escape. And he's so nice and folksy, and he reminds me of people from Texas that I knew. So I got a kick out of that. I'm looking forward to season 2.
Yeah, like I said, I like playing golf. I'm not very good, and I'm kind of returning to it. And the be a goldfish line is my line right now. And, I need to have the memory of a goldfish. I don't need to think about that crappy thing I just did. 5 seconds, boop, it's gone, and I need to move forward. And I think it was a very cute little show.
Yeah, it's fun. I love soccer. I just like I'm kind of an Anglophile in some ways. I do like England. And so it's kind of, and it's very folksy too, because he's from the US. So you've got all those things, and it's very, it's kind, I guess. It's a good fun.
We, also talking about shows, we've been having a conversation on Slack channels, and one food show that we've discovered recently is Lakshmi's Taste of the Nation, which is on Hulu, and it's a fantastic show on American food, but the immigrants' experience and the immigrant story in the foods that we eat today, and it's featuring communities across the U.S. and it's really nice.
I need to check that out.
And very educational, and a reminder that it isn't necessarily always a feel good from start to finish, but it's a great, and it should get you hungry.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of my family's, one part of my family anyways. We have family, my ancestry goes back in many different ways. I'm a big American mutt. But one is Italian, and we do still make ravioli the same way that we did, and I think I've told this story, but I went back to Italy in 2009 with my mom and my dad, and my mom is half Italian, and we went to the village where she was, where her family was from. It's just north of the Cinque Terre and east of Chiavari. And it's a little town up in the hills, and there's a restaurant there called La Brinca. And if anybody gets a chance to go to La Brinca, please go. It's an amazing little place, and I'm sure that the people there are my family members in some form or fashion. But they brought out ravioli, and we looked at it, took one look at it, and it's the exact same way we make it. And it was a really nice connection to the place where we're from. And things change. They use borage, which is a kind of a different vegetable than the Swiss chard that we use. But, that you have to, when you move to a new country, you have to make those kind of adaptations. And I think you talk about that show. I haven't seen it, but it sounds fascinating from that perspective, because, the Italians moved from the Liguria into San Francisco, and all the things like seafood stew. There's a really great piece that I have in a history book that I read about Ligurian cooking and why it is the way it is. And, and when it moved to San Francisco, there's a lot of Ligurians that moved here because of the climate. It's kind of similar to the Mediterranean climate, et cetera. So, those types of things are just eminently fascinating. And, there's so many lessons to learn from the adaptations that people make when they move to a new place. So I'll definitely check that out.
Yeah. I recommend it.
Well, Tracy, where can folks find you online?
They can find me on Twitter. Am I T McMillan or TE McMillan? I
think it's TE McMillan. It's TE.
Yes. But I'm there, kind of a mix of planning and politics and a little bit of family in my posts. So be all ready for that.
Awesome. You can find me on Twitter at @TheORedWire or at TheORedWire.com. Thanks for joining us on Mondays at The Red Wire. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks, Jeff. It was great seeing you.
It was great to see you too. And we'll see everybody else next time.
Talking